Hello, this is Jamie Flinchball. We're here to talk about strategy, and we have another guest, Nolan Godfrey. Thanks for joining us, and why don't you tell us a bit about yourself?
Yeah, thank you for having me, Jamie. So I am an executive consultant and coach, and also lead the Texas region for Stewart Leadership. And Stewart is a human capital consulting and coaching firm, and I'm based in Dallas.
Awesome. So thanks for sharing. And we've had the chance to work together, never really directly on strategy, but every time I've seen you present, you've talked about how strategy must drive structure and not the other way around. And so that's why I thought this would be a great conversation. And you and Stewart Leadership Firm have a framework where strategy is a key component of that framework. So maybe I'll ask two questions in one, and if they don't connect, we can break them out. But the first question is, how do you define strategy? And I guess the second question is, how does it fit within that framework that you do use?
Yeah, so those are great starting questions. So defining strategy for me really comes down to two core concepts. And the first is the essence of how an organization wins in its marketplace, whatever that looks like. And the second related to it is how they differentiate themselves from competitors and from others in their market, in their industry. So that for me is the foundation of strategy, and how it fits within the broader organization effectiveness and design framework that we do a lot of work with is it forms the foundation. It really is the foundation of any decision that a CEO on down to the front lines, any decision they're making always needs to be in the context of that strategy.
No, that's perfect. And so, strategy sets a context then for other decisions. And I guess just to ask a little bit more about that, is that in your experience in working with your clients, is that strategy at any level in the organization, or is it really just the corporate strategy and then how things connect to that?
Yeah, so I think it's both. I think that the corporate strategy at really the highest level of the organization, it has to be clear enough that it's informing all of those things, and that as that strategy gets cascaded into the organization and woven into everything that people are doing day in and day out to execute it, I think there has to be tight alignment there. And that's also a really important concept, is the idea that you could have a mediocre strategy, but build tight alignment at all levels of your organization and outperform your competitors that might have a classic textbook rock solid strategy, but that aren't able to execute it in an aligned way.
Yeah, and we'll come back to execution, because I think that's an important topic in this whole thing. So now in the creation end, so the front end of this strategy, you act as a coach, a facilitator, a guide, coming in from the outside. So I'm sure you've seen lots of variation around this, but how many people do you really include? How broad do you get the inputs, and can you muck it up with too many cooks in the kitchen?
Yeah. So it's a really interesting question. My point of view is ultimately the chief strategist is the CEO, or whatever title the head of a firm holds. That to me is a core function of that very most senior role, because the strategy is really that universal question, again, that informs everything. at the most practical level, it ultimately translates into day in and day out decisions that anyone is making at any level. You definitely can get too many cooks in the kitchen, but it's also important that you have enough people involved that you can get the key inputs as you're formulating it. Part of strategy is about resource allocation. So you absolutely want to understand very clearly, you know, what are your customers and your consumers needing, and what are they saying to you, and where are they headed in the future? And you also want to make sure that you're getting really strong inputs around financial capital, around technological capital, around human capital, because those are a lot of the key resources that get allocated as you start to implement a strategy. So it's a fine balance. And as long as everyone's clear, the decision ultimately rests with the CEO or that head of the firm, then, you know, getting strong inputs is really important.
Yeah, so some of that's the organizational inputs. So you have inputs from within the organization, you have them information that comes from the outside, you have unknowns to deal with. How do you make sure the right information is really coming to that decision, either on an ongoing basis or on a sort of strategic planning event basis?
Yeah, so I would say on the event basis, starting there, and again, this depends on the size of the firm and the complexity of the firm and the industry that you're dealing with. This is where a lot of larger firms will use a strategy consulting firm to get a lot of those inputs, because, you know, a firm that specializes in a particular industry can provide, you know, a wealth of information about competitors and about trends and those kinds of things. I think that's important to remember. That should be an input. I would never recommend outsourcing strategy, so to speak. To me, that's the core function, again, of any kind of firm at its root. I think in terms of the ongoing information, I think that's where having a really strong management system internal to the organization that is producing the kind of information, the kind of measurements, the kinds of trends, again, in whatever ways your strategy is broken out, that is critical, because you'll be able to make adjustments real time if you have that kind of information, as opposed to, you know, building a strategy, putting it on a shelf, and, you know, hoping that it's right for the next 5 years without making any adjustments to it. So I think having both of those inputs is critical for different reasons.
Yeah. No, I think that's a good contrast, right? So the outside event-based, and then having your management system really be able to flow the information that should be getting there on a regular basis so you can be informed. Certainly, although we've seen this far too many times, is outsourcing the strategy to another firm. I always say there's a reason they call lawyers counsels. All they should do is counsel you, but you got to make the decision in the end. And it sometimes it's comfortable to say, well, these guys did the analysis and they say we should go this way. And even though it might not have been implied in the contract with the consulting firm, you know, how often does the leader disagree with their recommendations? That becomes a dangerous equation, I think, around who really owns the decision.
It does become dangerous, and, you know, what can happen is over reliance, the senior executive or that senior leadership team, what can happen is they aren't as involved and engaged in that process as they need to be to understand it and to be able to make informed decisions. The other mistake that I see frequently is when a CEO will rely too heavily on whoever their right-hand person is, whatever role or person that is, when they rely too heavily, the challenge I see frequently is that individual is typically in a role in some kind of silo, and too much of that particular agenda can make its way into informing the strategy. So whether that's on the technology side, on the people side, on the finance side, operations, and that's ultimately why it's so important. That's why you have that CEO role, is to balance all of those inputs and make the hard choices that have to be made, and those hard trade-offs. If you do the strategy right, typically you're going to have everyone on that senior team. There are going to be trade-offs that they may not be happy with if they're just thinking about their little piece of the pie. But if they're thinking about the entire enterprise, then it should align quite well. And that's a challenge.
Yeah. So, just this might be an unfair question, but based on your experience, you talk about leaders who aren't as involved in the process as they should be. Is there common reasons for that, or common personality traits, or common scenarios? I mean, what really drives? Seems like something you'd want your fingerprints all over. So what leads people to be less engaged in that process than they should be?
Yeah, I think it's a great question. The general answer I'd give is it really depends. It depends on the firm and the players and the team that's in place. A whole host of reasons. But a few that I typically see. Number one, if you've got an executive that for whatever reasons is just not as savvy and influential as some of their teammates, that can play out. And, the most savvy of those senior executives are always going to have their eye on strategy, and they're always going to be looking at ways to influence it and to provide strong inputs. And not just because they're trying to drive an agenda, that's selfish or focused on their piece of the pie, but because they understand that's a critical role that they play. So sometimes you'll have leaders at that level that are just not as savvy and not as skilled at doing that. That's one. A second thing that I see, each company does tend to have a culture around which functions have greater influence and power. And so, for example, on the healthcare side, healthcare tends to be so people-centric, right? I mean, the business of healthcare is the business of people. And so a lot of times you can find that a chief people officer is very influential, more so than you might find in some other industries. So there can tend to be some of those tendencies across different industries. But I would say it's probably a bigger factor of the individual and their savvy and skill at being able to position their function or their business unit and to be able to give those valuable inputs from a strategic perspective.
Yeah, that's a good perspective. I do think there certainly is that factor where certain functions in an organization will sort of, I always say, hold their head up a little higher, right? Their outsized influence. And in some cases, that's very effective because it's the centerpiece of the strategy. But it certainly affects the strategy, whether you intended it or not, from a dynamic standpoint. So,
absolutely.
So as you have your strategy, as you talked about, everyone has to understand how they connect to it and what it's influencing. So what's the best way to communicate that? So we have a strategy. How do we really get it out across to the organization so people do understand how they fit in?
Yeah, so I think what's really important, and this sounds so simple, it's mostly about taking the time to actually do it. So at whatever level you have your strategy crafted, taking enough time at each level of the organization to articulate it, to allow people to kind of wrestle with it a little bit, to understand it, and to work through it is so critical. I see most organizations significantly underinvest in the time that they take. And this is why, typically you'll see companies, they'll put together some kind of goal setting, goal cascading kind of framework, activities. And the challenge there is that it becomes a checkbox, or it becomes a process to move through, and it loses the emphasis on truly helping individuals understand at the highest level what is the company about and how they fit into that. And if you think about, easy example, think of any kind of sports team. Sports teams, especially teams, spend a significant amount of time communicating and explaining and working through strategy at all levels. I think they're a great model for how you do that. So it's really important. I'll share the best way I've actually seen this is through the huddle process. So the lean huddles, an organization that I worked with, I saw them implement those at all levels of the organization. Everyone knew at whatever their level, whatever their role was, their key metrics and the key priorities that they had, and they were talking about them on a daily basis, tracking them typically daily at the front lines anyway. And by far the most effective strategy, execution, and communication that I've seen.
Yeah, I think when you can break it down to something that someone can engage with every single day, it's much more meaningful. And you certainly see these sort of one-time rollouts, right? We're going to package up the strategy, roll it out across the organization, and it's just not enough, right? I think the frequency of that communication, one way or the other, is important. It doesn't always have to be from one person, but overall, the message has to have some frequency to really get out and to connect to people. And huddles are a great way to help do that.
Yeah, I will share one other quick example where I saw this it was in a pretty fun and engaging way. So one firm I was with leveraged learning maps. Some people call them knowledge maps, but basically it was a life-size, almost like board game kind of board. And it showed the company's core processes. And over several hours, it was kind of a training workshop format. It allowed people, especially at the front lines, to understand how different customer needs moved through their value chain to create a product or a service at the end of the day. And it gave them all kinds of insights into the strategy. And on the surface, it took people 2 or 3 hours investment, not a significant amount of time, but it brought it to life for them. So there are a lot of things you can do when you're being creative about it that don't have to take, weeks and weeks to involve people.
Mm-hmm. Well, that's good. And so you've already touched on this a bit around turning strategy into execution. What other advice do you have in effectively converting to execution?
Yeah, so converting into execution, I would say, one thing is I'd say at more of a universal level. This is where a lot of the work that you were partnered with me on around organization design. This is where at that again, more kind of strategic level, you're making choices about how you're organized, about how work flows through an organization, about technology, about organization structures. All of those things are impacting how you're executing your strategy and the ultimate results that come from that. So I would say that is a really key component, and organizations that do that well tend to have a much better execution and much better results. At more of an individual level, that's where I see the critical role that a supervisor plays, again, at whatever level, in making sure that people are clear about what they need to do, how they contribute to the overall organization, to the strategy, having measures in place that bring that to life. Even at the most basic and foundational level, I think those are a few of the ways that I have seen most effective companies do that.
Yeah, and I certainly agree that organizational structure must follow strategy. And so once you have a strategy, you should ask yourself how your org design should change. I guess just digging into that a bit further, how frequently should your strategy drive your org design changes? Can you over adjust too frequently? And I guess follow on is, what's more common, under adjusting or over adjusting?
Yeah, great question. So yeah, you definitely can under and over adjust, and there's not a real black and white answer on that. Technically speaking, anytime your strategy shifts, you should reevaluate your organization. Mm-hmm. Now, what I tend to say is, usually what that ought to mean is anytime your strategy significantly shifts, for example, setting a strategy about how you're going to differentiate in the marketplace, and a broad vision around that, that's typically a 3 to 5 year time frame, with annual adjustments, quarterly, strategy and ops review kinds of mechanisms in place. So I would say at a corporate or at a universal level, looking every time that strategy really shifts significantly is important. But again, on the more practical side, you're always adjusting and adapting tactics and how you're operating. And so some of those more micro decisions, you're going to be making them day in and day out. But across a corporation, I've seen where organizations are too restructure happy, if you will, mm-hmm. and they're restructuring every 6 months, and it just creates unnecessary chaos most of the time. And I also recommend, what I see a lot is organizations will also leave this for too long, where they'll just let an organization sit stale. And I think the most effective are incorporating it in their annual strategy process to always be at least considering and looking and saying, are there significant changes that we need to consider or not? So that it's just a continuous, it's continuous improvement really at the organization level.
Yeah, great. Now, one of the hardest things I found people to try to answer is really how we measure strategy, right? So measurement, of course, is core to how any business operates. So how do you implement metrics for the strategy or the strategy execution? Is it its own set, or do you integrate it? How do you approach that challenge?
Yeah, so at the ultimate level, and I'm stating the obvious here, the ultimate effectiveness of a strategy is simply how are you winning, right? How are you doing in your industry? But in terms of getting granular and getting specific for a firm, I think there are a number of ways. So number one, I do like the power and uniformity of external metrics. So if you're a public company, you've got those core stock price, earnings per share kinds of metrics to track at the highest level. I think you also need to be looking at depending on the core of your strategy, what are critical industry metrics within that? So for example, if the core of your strategy was to differentiate through customer experience, then I might recommend something like having Net Promoter Score be, that might be your key metric across the entire organization. And you could play that out, any kind of strategy, if it's about efficiencies and low cost, if it's about product differentiation, whatever that might be. So at the top level, those are some of the ways. There are also some more internally focused ways. These tend to come out of employee experience or engagement type surveys. So you can test at the front line, to what degree do people understand where things are headed, how they connect to them. Do they understand what your customers' most important requirements are? Those kinds of measures. So there are a number of ways to get at it. Again, I think that having a multi-prong approach to it, but also being focused in that, can be really important.
That's good. So I don't think there's a single metric. So having that breadth and portfolio becomes key. So before we wrap up, any last thoughts you'd like to leave us with on strategy and strategic planning?
Yeah, so I would just emphasize that for a lot of firms, and this is independent of kind of firm size or industry, I see a lot of leaders talking as if strategy was goals or targets. What I hear probably the most frequent when I ask the question, hey, what is your strategy? They say, our strategy is to grow. And then they put a percentage around it. Mm-hmm. And for me, that's a target. That's a goal. It's not a strategy. Right. It's not saying, this is how we're different and this is how we compete and this is how we win. So to me, that really is the essence of it. And by its nature, it requires you to answer, what are we not going to do? What are we going to say no to? What opportunities will we say no to because they take us away from that core strategic focus? I think those are they're very simple concepts. They're very challenging to do in kind of the real world. And I see most leaders struggle with those things.
Great. So, strategy is a task, a big task, and requires leadership to be involved, to think big, to be clear, and ultimately help the organization organize around all of that. So I think that brings us home. Really appreciate your experience and sharing your perspective with us here today. Thank you.
Yeah, my pleasure. Thanks so much for the opportunity.